Hi guys, welcome to my percussion revolver class. Okay, today we're going to deal with the 1860 Army. Now for those of you that are familiar, this is an 1860 Army. This is a modern reproduction by Uberti. Okay, this is the fluted cylinder. We're going to talk about that right quick. How the 1860 Army came to be was because of a need for a lighter, more powerful handgun. Prior to this, the belt gun by Colt in military service was the 51 Navy, which was 36 caliber. And this was a very good belt gun. It provided good firepower, good accuracy, good reliability in field conditions. And for the most part, it served the purpose. But along with this, you had the 49 pocket model, which was the biggest seller in all of Colt. And that was used as a personal defense gun, carried in a pocket. A lot of officers would carry that small gun on a belt because for the most part, officers didn't fight. They were giving commands. They were holding their saber up. They were a director on the battlefield rather than an actual combat participant. And so that served well. But on the other end, you had dragoons, an early precursor to our cavalry. And they shot the big heavy dragoon revolvers, which had come from the Walker 1st, 2nd, 3rd model dragoon. By the beginning of the Civil War, it was the 3rd model dragoon. Now this is a big, powerful gun that carried a large powered charge and could take a horse down, could take large game down, and served well as a shock and awe weapon for a cavalry unit, which would zoom in at high speed, pumping rounds, and these guns were quite often carried on the pommel of the saddle. And so you didn't see many of them carried on their belt. That's what made the movie character of Josie Wales and the Confederates kind of stand out, because it was noted in many of the literatures of the day how the Confederates would have multiple guns stuck in belts on their body for that type high speed, high volume, lightning fast rate of riding in the middle of the troops at close range and letting them have it. Okay, they wanted something that had the firepower of the dragoon and yet was not as bulky or as heavy, because those were 4-pound guns. Could you get me something more in the size and weight class of the 51 but could handle that 44? And in the Colt Museum you have the prototype. Now what they did with a 51 Navy is they went right here and they cut away the frame, deepened it down, made a rebated. This is called a water table. And then they made a new cylinder that was bigger and thicker all the way around, called a rebated cylinder. And I will show you that in a minute. They rounded the barrel because Colt was going to that rounded configuration, and we wanted it to be harder to duplicate. By this point of the late 1850s, there were a lot of people out there wanting to make copies of the Colt. And Colt had to go to court many times, and this octagonal barrel was simply too easy to make. And so they decided to go with a more streamlined, rounded look. And so they rounded this barrel. They made the one prototype and they bored it out to 44 caliber and created the 44 caliber cylinder. And it worked well. That was the prototype. From that we get the 1860 Army. Now, the first runs of the 1860s were like this. They had this fluted cylinder. Again, we're trying to cut that weight down, remember. We're coming from that big dragoon. Yes, it's got the 44 caliber, but can I make it a little lighter, closer to that 51 Navy in weight? And so this was their effort to shrink it down even further. And some of the very first ones were these rebated, fully rebated cylinders. And you can see that up close, these flutes. In fact, when you put it on half cock, the flute is actually, you can actually whistle down the barrel a little bit. You can see where it's so low right there. It doesn't completely come up to the height of the barrel. This did not work out well. Yes, it did lighten the gun and etc., but disadvantage. The metallurgy of the day could not keep up, and many of these cylinders cracked, split, busted in actual combat service. so much so that Colt quit making them and went to making the rebated cylinder. Now let me show you that right quick. Okay, this is what ended up being on the 1860. This rebated, we call it, cylinder. And the fluted was now gone and just a simple barrel. This was much easier to manufacture. But with this fluid shape, this is what Colt was going for, is a way to hide, well, not really hide, but to kind of trademark the Colt guns, because this being milled to this fluid flowing shape was very difficult, and so therefore it would make his competitors have to invest a lot of money to compete it. You see a lot of fakes of the Dragoons, of the 51s. You don't see many fakes of the 1860s in history, because it was so much harder and much more money in depth to make this fluid barrel. So therefore Colt did win in that. Now this was one of the greatest guns of the Civil War. It and the 51 Navy were still serving side by side. They did not get rid of the 51 Navy just because this came on board. But this gave the 44-45 punch, and the 36 still was very accurate. And therein you get a little bit of, like we hear today, between 9mm and 45, and actually that's where it started. Those that were a big fan, there were quite a few notable people in history that were a big fan of the 51 Navy, like Wild Bill Hickok and many of the Civil War officers. They claim it shot more accurately, less recoil, was better on powder because it used a smaller powder charge, better on lead because the bullet was smaller and lighter, and therefore I got more bullets per pound of lead, and therefore it was a better field gun for the day and would put a man down just as well. On the other hand, the guys that liked and shot the 44s, they claimed it was more decisive, that a hit from this puts you down. They were not in any hurry to get back up. And so it shot harder, they said. It generated more power. It penetrated better, and therefore was much more usable in the field. So it was two schools of thought: booming power or accuracy. Okay? Now, the 1860 Army served throughout the entire Civil War, and immediately after the war you saw a lot of these go into conversions. At the end of the war, and as I mentioned in my Remington cap and ball revolver class, after 1863, I believe it was, there weren't any more orders for any of the Colts. They were buying the Remingtons because the Remingtons were cheaper, they shot well, etc. And so the Colt orders were still filling orders, but there were no new orders placed. And when the war ended, these were kind of left in the lurch. And Colt had a lot of parts. I mean, a lot of parts for this. And so, waiting for the through cylinder, where you put a bullet in the back, to expire that Smith & Wesson had, Remington went ahead and paid a royalty to Smith & Wesson so they could make conversion cylinders quicker. Colt wanted some sort of conversion. And so the Thur conversion came up, where they had some adaptation to this, and you loaded from the front with a proprietary cartridge. It was not a good idea. But then came the Richards conversion, where they mounted a rear sight up here. They bobbed the top of the hammer. They put a plate in here with a firing pin, and they cut off the back of the cylinder and made it where you could load in directly. Now, many of those were a rimfire cartridge. But the Richards conversion came out in about 1870, and then in 1871 you had the Richards Mason conversion, which went back to having this type of rear sight. And I will show you a picture of I will show you a side by side between this 1860 and a Richards Mason conversion right here. Okay, guys. Here's my 1860 Army, and there is my 1871 Richards Mason conversion. Now this was the cartridge firearm that came from this. Like I said, at the end of the war, they had lots of blank casings. So they're going to tell you, but that is a from scratch built cylinder. That is correct, but it's the same billet that made the percussion cylinder. They just made a cartridge out of it. Colt had all these laying around. And so the barrel blank was easily turned into this. They're using like 80 or 90% of the parts off of this gun to make this gun. The only difference is the ring back here on the back that becomes the loading gate and etc. The firing pin is different, and the cylinder is different, but the same blank that made this could make this. And so this, with just a modified frame and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, they could create this gun. And so the 1860 did serve on, not just in the, percussion form. It became this gun. And this gun and the next one, the 72 open top, which were scratch built guns using these castings and parts and designs and jigs and tooling meant to make this, could easily be adapted to make that, became the 72 open top. And the next year, 73, we got the Single Action Army. Colt was still producing guns, but they weren't manufacturing. What they're doing, guys, is at the end of the war they had tons of parts, tons and tons of parts left over. And I read a in-depth report from a collector years ago that was showing like 1886 or 7. They were shipping 51 Navy going somewhere, where somebody just contacted Colt and said, I want a 51 Navy. Well, they had the parts and they had the tool guy put it together. They weren't manufacturing anything, but they did have parts. They assembled it and sold it to him. Plus parts guns. Okay. When the Army got rid of one, sent it back to Colt for a busted barrel, let's say, or whatever. Colt replaced it, whatever. Well, they ended up at the end of the war with a lot of those guns. Well, they just fixed the parts. And what did they do with them? Those are called mismatched Colts. Quite often they got completely different serial numbers on several parts, and they're parts gun. And a lot of times they were dealers that were going out into the West to sell, and they'd assemble these and sell them, because you had the $21 a piece gun, and I had these for $3. Still sell them, still get use out of the parts, you know what I mean? And so you see the guns still being used up until the late 1800s, and like I said with that gentleman I knew, into the 1960s, that 1860 was still serving as a personal home defense weapon. So these things kept going. So this became a cartridge conversion to a cartridge gun. These guns continued to serve well into the end of the 1800s, and in some cases of people that were poor and didn't have any better, they also served into the early 1900s. In the 1960s, I think about 68, I became friends with a family, and the old black gentleman who lived just up the block from me still had his daddy's 1860 Army that he served as a Buffalo soldier in the 1880s in the U.S. military. That was his gun when he retired, and he had inherited it from his father, who had been that Buffalo soldier. And that gun was still serving as home defense in 1967. This gentleman was of low income means. He was just a very old man in his late 80s when I got to know him. But the gun that he carried rabbit hunting, and the gun that he carried for personal protection at home or when he was out in the field, was an 1860 Army. First one I'd ever seen. The old Army gun, he called it. With a change in cylinders, today you can put modern cartridge conversions onto this where it's a 2-piece cylinder, and convert this over to 45 Colt. Now, let's talk about loads a minute, because that's something I promised I'd do in this video. So let's jump a minute to what is a load for one of these. Okay guys, now let's talk about loads. And there's a lot of information floating around about how this is a good load, this is an overload, don't ever do that, load this, whatever. And I would like to address some of the confusion and try to, explain where some of this confusion came from, okay? So let's go back to the beginning of when these guns had come about. When Colt had went to creating these guns in the 1830s, the metallurgy of that day was not very good at all. I mean, uniform steel was a hit and miss type thing. In the Pattersons, it did okay. When they scaled it up to the production rifles and shotguns, it still did okay. Not great. When they went to the Walker, they had a problem. The pressure was too great. Okay. Now, let me give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about pressure and what the basic difference is of many things. A greatly simplified idea of the difference between smokeless powder and black powder. In black, smokeless, we want to create a powder charge that has a burn rate that will produce, let us say, 30,000 PSI pressure, or 30,000 cup. But we're going to say 30K. Okay? From time of ignition till it hits 30K is how long? That's the major difference, because the smokeless will combust much faster. It's nitrocellulose based, nitroglycerin based. Whoosh, it goes faster. Let's think cars for a second. Black powder is a big old pickup truck, and it does 0 to 60 in 8 seconds. Okay? Smokeless powder is a Ferrari. It does 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. See the difference? Woof! And it's at pressure. Well, how does that affect? Because this comes up to pressure so fast, the metal has to be treated and prepared and be of a proper material to handle that sudden spike in pressure. Because that pressure is spiked, poof, and now it's going to blow the projectile out the barrel like a cork out of a bottle. Poof, go. It'd be like me wanting to reach 30,000 PSI and I open an air hose real slowly and come up to it and the bullet starts moving, and I do reach 30 before it reaches the end of the barrel, burning the length. Whereas this, boom, 100% right now it's at 30,000 PSI. Boom. And if that steel can't expand, can't hold, can't contain it, can't whatever, something got to give. Okay? So that's a kindergarten comparison, okay, between the two. Whenever Colt went and made the Walker, which had a capacity of 60 grains of black powder, that pressure was too high. If it was loaded incorrectly, we've heard about how they would take the pointed bullets and load them backwards into it. People didn't have a lot of experience yet with these cannonballs. We've got 150 years of understanding what this was, but this was a Luke Skywalker lightsaber to the average person in the field at this time, where the average muzzleloader, you dumped X amount of powder with a patch ball down the thing, and you let it went. If you had a little extra, a little less, no big deal, you know, as long as you didn't double charge it. And most guns could handle a double or triple charge. In fact, you read reports in combat of guys talking about they double charged the first rounds. So like, bam, burn, blind, and deafen type deal. And the guns would eventually let go. But you get my idea. See, 60 grains was too much. The metallurgy of the day could not keep up with it. And the cylinders split. They fatigued. Okay? So the military came up with a load. And I believe the initial load, they had dropped it down to 50. And then by the start of the Civil War, I think it had dropped down to 45 or 48 was the thing with the conical bullet. That's one of the reasons, A, for speed and military action, that preloaded paper cartridges became such a necessity, so that someone in the field could load repeatedly fairly fast. But therein brings our first point, okay? So let's say 1860, and you're the ordnance guy that has to have cartridges made up in some of the factory conditions to ship to the field. What are the cartridges going to be? Well, the revolvers are 36-44. Ah, there's a difference. This is the cylinder of a 51 Navy. This is the cylinder of a Whitney or a Spiller and Burr. If you put them side by side, they're almost the same size, except this cylinder has a 5 grain higher capacity than this cylinder, just by the way it's manufactured, the depth and etc., the depth of the holes, how it's manufactured, where it's put together, etc. Slight differences. Now add in a 36 caliber Remington, the Manhattans, the Forsyths, the Savages, the Stars, all these others that were in 1860 in use. It wasn't uniform, and the Army had to come up with something that would fit all of them, you know, because you did not want to have ammunition that got to this troop and it couldn't be loaded. It was too large a capacity. So now I got to tear the cartridge apart, pour powder in, maybe dump a little out, put the ball in, and see it slowed everything down. I should be able to put it in and ram it. So they had to come up with a load that would work in all of these revolvers. Well, this is a higher capacity, and there's probably something else that may have been a higher capacity than this. And so I've got to match the lowest common denominator. So what gun in service fits this, and then we'll shoot it in that. That's what they had to do. And so that's when you see these ordnance loads for 18 grains of powder in a conical bullet, or 23 grains of coarse pistol powder in a conical bullet. Conical bullets were preferred because A, they give greater penetration, and I want that in a combat setting where mass troops up close. So if I shoot and I get a hit and it goes through me, might have enough oomph to hurt the next guy. And wounded means a guy out of the fight. That's the important part. A dead guy, nobody's got to take care of him. But a wounded guy you got to take care of, and that drains resources. And so the more wounded you can inflict on the enemy, yes, you want a casualty, but you want wounded more than anything else. The greater the drain it is on their limited resources, and therefore better for your tactical thing. So a conical bullet penetrated better. So here in 1860, the Ordnance Board said that a 36 caliber cartridge, and I'm just coming up with a number, guy. I believe this is correct, but I may be wrong. But I seem to recall that on the 36 caliber, it was like 18 grains, I want to say, in a conical. And for the 44 caliber, for the big Johnson and Dow type bullet, it was, I believe, a 20 grain or maybe a 24 grain charge. I may be wrong on that. But they came up with this. It's what fit all of them. Okay? Now these ordnance idea of what the load was supposed to be was what they made the cartridge. Of course, you could load with loose powder and ball. But we're talking about mass-produced ammunition. Okay? Now, the war ends, these guns don't just go poof and disappear. They're still used. They're moving through the West. It was still a very common gun in the West. They become more and more as time goes by. They become the poor guy's gun, the guy that can't afford much. That becomes our gun. The more expensive guys, or somebody like a sheriff or something with an expense account, can get the nice Colt 45s or the government pistols or etc. Those are still out there, they're still available, and that's a month's salary or more for a lot of the common workers. Something that could not easily be spared. So the transition does occur, but just because a gun exists don't mean everybody threw their other guns and claimed it was obsolete and went to it. Okay? So these guns kept going through time. Now let's jump to right after World War II. Let's say 1950s. Okay, 1950s. National Muzzleloading Rifle Association. up out of Indiana. Prior to World War II, there were some shooting matches that had got going. When you go back and you look at the early westerns from the 1930s that were in black and white, all the guns you're seeing are originals. There ain't no replicas being made prior to World War II. And really not prior, before 1950 or so. And so they're actually the original guns that are cheap enough around, they can use them in the movies, they can afford for the bad guy to get hit and go flying, etc. You know, it was a prop because those guns were dirt cheap. Well, it also kind of inspired the average guy, because this gun that had been carried in the war and came home, and that's mine, and I fought in the war, and I may have been a grown man in 1860. Well, by 1890, 30 years later, I may be 60, 70 years old. I may have passed that gun down. In the 1960s, I knew a black gentleman who had an original 1860 Armory that his daddy had carried as a Buffalo soldier in the 1800s as a cavalry officer out west, a Buffalo soldier he'd carried in 1860. And that was his gun, and he was still using it for home defense in 1968, because that had been his daddy's gun. He was an old man now, but you get my point. The guns just didn't go poof. Okay. The National Muzzleloading Rifle Association got together and started doing shoots and matches for flintlocks, for percussion guns, so these old muzzleloaders, and yes, even the cap and ball revolvers. Now you got to remember, this gun is an original. Something that fought in the Civil War. And the average person at that time don't really understand how to load it. That knowledge has kind of been lost. You know, it was your granddaddy's gun. He may have showed you how to load it, and you load it with a loose powder and ball. He knew how to do that. You know, but what load goes in it? How much? And so you look at some of the early publications by the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association talking about this and the loads and etc. And there was a gentleman, I'm really pulling here, guys, but I want to think the gentleman's name was Schubert, in early like 50s, and he wrote a thing for a publication for the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association from the range up there, and was talking about an accurate load in one of these percussion guns, one of these cap and ball revolvers. And he was talking about an 1860, and how he had gone and done research into what the Ordnance Board said to put in them. And since these are old antique guns, that load was well under capacity. You know, depending on the 1860, you can put 35 grains, almost, some of them you can put 40 grains in under a round ball. And so me shooting 24, 25 grains, okay. Again, they don't have a lot of knowledge. It's just a piece of history, but, you know, they don't have our internet or stuff to research it. Most books would just mention it as a Civil War gun. It was not what we think of yet. And so they, in their books and publications and things about it, went with that. In fact, in the early matches, it had to be an original. Now, a gentleman by the name of Val Forget, who had come out of World War II, Navy, EOD, disarming stuff and stuff like that, had been to Italy, and he's the one that took a 1851 Navy, and he went out to Italy and found Uberti and them, and said, hey, can you make one of these? This is the valley that had been making guns since the 1600s. You know, they'd been making guns for the Nazis, they'd been making guns for the Italian army, and this is just like 10 years or less after World War II. Their infrastructure is devastated. They're desperate for anything to make money, because this is where they've been making guns for hundreds of years. They want to make guns. So when he showed up with that, yeah, they took the contract and they made a replica 1851 Navy. So he said, well, now you, hey, that looks cool. You saw it in the movies, and you may be a Civil War enthusiast, and you buy one of these, and you have no clue how to load it. It don't stick bullets in the back. So, what sources do you go to? National Muzzleloading Rifle Association or Navy Arms or Dixie Gun Works. All of those went back and rubber stamped those original military loads. Here it is. And the Dixie Gun Works catalog, whenever you'd go look at it, it would show, let's say, a 1860 Army. And at the bottom it'd say, load 3F powder, this powder charge, da-da-da-da. All of those were very mild loads. All of those were relatively weak loads. This was, I'm trying to be, throughout all of my guns that are available, no matter what the Colt could actually hold, I'm just putting a flat thing. These are manufacturing and rubber stamping back that, plus it's a target gun. It's a play gun. Most of them, the vast majority of them, by the 1960s, here comes the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War. And a lot of your historic parks, like Gettysburg, Shiloh, stuff like that are national parks of these battlefields, wanted to do reenactments. And so they were big time encouraging, trying to get people to come out and do these reenactments. So the guns kind of came to the forefront a little bit more. Publications, getting into movies, westerns, etc. All of it fanned the flame, and so people like Dixie Gun Works, Navy Arms, and others got involved, like Lyman and several others. They went to importing guns. So much so that in Italy, other manufacturers went to making them, and in other places. So you get San Marco, you get Uberti, you get Pieta, you get Century Arms, Western Arms. There was all kinds of companies floating around. That's when I was getting into the early 70s. But here in the 60s, for the Civil War reenactment, it greatly went uphill. And again, you know, who do they going to ask where this gun's from? They're going to ask Navy Arms, they're going to ask Dixie Gun Works. And Dixie Gun Works was a big source of it because their catalog never changed. It lists the same load. I saw a Dixie Gun Works catalog that was from like 2008, I think it was, and they listed the loads in it then. And it was identical to an old 1961 I had at that time. I've since given both those catalogs away to somebody else that collects old books. But, I mean, it was identically the same. They just rubber stamped it, you know. Now, is it a bad thing? No. It works just fine like that. Is it the full performance of the gun? No, not even close. Because when you went and looked at the third model Dragoon, what was the load for the third model Dragoon? 35 grains. 35 grains. That's from 1860. What's the actual capacity of it? Full to the top is 50 grains. You can actually put 40, 45 in there if you compress it real hard and put a ball on top of it. So you're 10 grains below maximum. Greatly erring on the side of safety. Now, why would they do that? These original guns are still there, remember? When NMLRA started doing it, they were all originals. These were old antiques that had fought a war 100 years ago. And it then saw service in the West, and then probably saw service with the poorest people that, you know, this was all they could afford, you know. So it'd been a lot of use and abuse and wear and tear and missed cleanings and everything else. So they're a little, yeah, keep it mild because of fear of the guns being abused or fatigue or metal fatigue or whatever. Now let's touch on that. Metal fatigue. Okay. Remember I said that when Colt went to Whitney and they created the walkers and a good part of them blew up. The metallurgy couldn't handle that pressure. Okay. When you go look at single action armies, okay, that one right there is a single action army. That's what you see in all the cowboy movies and etc., right? There are two kinds of frames on them. Did you know that? There's a black powder frame and a smokeless frame. If it was manufactured before, I think 1910 or so, it's a black powder frame and should only be shot with black powder, even today. I don't care if it's a, you know, a 38 or whatever. It's for black powder. And you're not supposed, so if it's a 45 Colt, you're supposed to only shoot black powder in it. Because here's the thing, those cylinders are not heat treated. None of these back here, none of the 1860, 1851, the Smiths, the Savage, none of them were heat treated. They took a bar of round steel, milled it to create that cylinder. There was no additional heat treating other than going through and being blued and etc. There was no heat treat. The ordnance steel should be able to handle the expected pressures. Smith & Wesson, yes, Smith & Wesson with the swing out cylinder, did not start pressure treating their guns, their cylinders, until the 1930s. And not every model. By the time the 357 came online, yes, you had to have pressure treated cylinders. And all modern guns are heat treated. But before that, all the guns, basically, there'd be a great exception to the rule, of any of the guns produced in the 1800s did not have heat treated cylinders or heat treated anything. It wasn't necessary. The springs and stuff, but I'm talking about the big running gear. Not heat treated. It's just steel milled to shape. That was it. And this pops up again and again. Now, metal fatigue. Okay? This is a 44 caliber. Actually, it's 45. This is an 1860 Army. I want you to look between the cylinders of a 36 and then between the cylinders of a 44. Notice how thin that is right there? That's called the web. And every time you fire, that cylinder does this. It flexes because it's ordnance steel, kind of like a spring steel. To contain the pressure, it swells out and then it releases. Over and over and over. You're working that metal. Usually when the guns blow up, it's a 44 caliber. And usually when they go, it's the webs between that let go. And then the top of the cylinder comes off, because it will detonate the two on the other side, and that's triple the power, and the ball hardly even started moving. Boom, the top of it goes away. Now, to prove to you this is not strictly just a percussion revolver thing, this is from Mike Ventrino, one of the most knowledgeable men there is, in my opinion, on single action, black powder guns, etc. I learned a ton from Mr. Mike. From his book, that's his gun. That was a well-kept 1914 vintage. Blew up in 1991 shooting regular mile loads out of a 45 Colt. It just blew to pieces. Now this was supposed to be a heat-treated cylinder. This was an original Colt. Didn't seem to be abused. Mike had full confidence in it. It didn't seem to have any problems, and he had had it a long time and shot it quite often. But at point X, it let go. So many people talk about you cannot load these guns. If you go over 20 grains in the 36, you're horribly damaging it and the gun's going to bust and fall apart. If you have an original gun, I agree with that. Because those guns that fought so long, been so long, etc., you know, it's just smart not to do it. Get a replica. but all the modern made replicas, certainly one that's been made within the last 10 years, has a heat treated cylinder. Since cartridge conversions became common in cap and ball revolvers, their cylinders have to be tough. Even though it's a percussion revolver, right? They're made out of the same stock. And so they just go ahead and get heat treated. And so you have to be able to have a revolver that can handle a 45 Colt or a 350, or excuse me, or a 38 Special. So the modern revolvers are much, much stronger and tougher than any of the originals or any of the cap and ball revolvers that were made pre-1990. Definitely, you know, after 2000, they're light years tougher, better made, higher quality. So a full cylinder is not going to damage it. How long before a gun will simply wear out? Because the Colt design being 3 pieces, action, barrel, and the pin, you know, how long until that gets loose? Well, that's what the wedge is for. It's there to be a replaceable part so I can pop it in and take up slack as that wedge takes the battering of the barrel, etc. So that's one. Two, honestly, how much are you going to shoot? The guys that are competing, serious competing in cowboy action, and they're shooting probably 10,000, you know, anywhere from 5 to 10,000 rounds a year through theirs. And I'm not hearing about guns blowing up regularly. I'm hearing about those odd, it's like an airplane crashing. When was the last time you heard an airplane crash? Oh, about it, right. The last I heard, and this is just a couple of years ago, they said that on any given day there is close to 3/4 to 1 million flights on Earth somewhere. That's that many airplanes. 3/4 to 1 million aircraft in the air over the whole world every day. And so there are just so many flights. Murphy's Law, one of them's going to go down, but it makes world headlines. And I hear people, you know, they'll come up and they'll say, well, da-da-da, and they'll put forth this image of this thing. Cap and Ball had someone return, I guess he sells guns as well, for Percussion, from the Cap and Ball channel, and he had a 1861 Navy with the barrel split the full length of it. That is obviously a plug barrel where they had a squib load. The ball got stuck in the barrel and somebody pulled the trigger again and the next one split the barrel the full length. The rest of the gun was perfectly fine. You could probably put another barrel on it and it'd been cool. You know, the pressure was in the barrel, it just split and let go. It did what it was supposed to do the way it failed. And the 36 cylinder doesn't fail easy because it's so thick. The 44s are the thin ones. I've seen the other one where it's a 58 Remington and it's split from one end to the other. It split through the bolt lock notch. How many rounds were fired through that gun? You know, was it a brand new gun? Was it a gun that had been around a little while? Or was it a gun you'd used in competition, you were shooting 10,000 a year and you used it for the last 5 years, so it's been 50,000 rounds through that gun. About time, you know, for something to go. So, I'm not trying to belittle anybody, I'm not. But loads of the guns coming off the shelf, you go buy one today, brand new, and you load it within reason. You find an accurate load. I have a low target load. I have a accurate load that's my daily carry, so to speak. And then I have a heavy load. That heavy load may be a Johnson & Dow bullet or a Kato Ojama bullet for hunting. That's something special. I'm not going to tote it in it every day. That puts more wear and tear on my gun. So the load of my load is going to be somewhere around here because it's the most accurate and it gives me a good hit for it. And I know that people are going to say, you know, that, well, you don't need all that, Blackie. It's just, yeah. Why don't you take your 40 Smith & Wesson and load it down to 400 feet per second? Or take your 357 and load it down to 300 feet per second. That's all you need to punch a hole in a piece of paper. No, we're Americans. We want to burn, blind, and deafen them. You go buy the most powerful automatic you can get. You know, boom, bam. You know, and I say, hell, load it down. Let's load it down. No, it wouldn't cycle, and etc. I had a good friend of mine that he wanted to go hunting with me, and I said, sure. And we went out after bunnies, and he brought these mammoth killer loads for a 357. I mean, these were made for heavy hunting. I mean, you're gonna try, you know, buffalo with this or something. And when he pulled the trigger, it was a deck blast like that right out in front of him. You know, and I'm going, you're shooting a 3-pound bunny. Ears and tails don't make much of a meal. Load it down. Put 38 specials in it or something. And then after a while, I got him into loading, and we learned to load it down to about 600 feet per second with a round ball that's supposed to go into a, been pushed through a die, and it's supposed to go into a 1861 Navy. It's a round ball. And so he's down to cap and ball ballistics out of this 357. But it was a joy to shoot. Pop, pop, pop. So loads are what is the job we're doing. If I'm going to be shooting targets, yeah, go low because it does a lot of things. And this is one of the reasons for these loads. Yes, it was for uniformity, but it was also conserve powder. Don't waste powder for what I'm not needing for this job. So if all I'm doing is poking holes in paper, if I can get an accurate load out of an 18 grain charge in an 1860 and save that 35 grain charge for a hunting load, I save powder. See, I can get 2 shots for 1 out of that. So there's enough powder in that low load to fill that gun up and shoot 2 times. Two full cylinders, see. I'm half the powder load for a target. I have a middle between that for a general. Then I have my heavy load for shooting. But understand, when you're seeing these charts, these numbers and everything, when they're talking about this, what they're really talking about is everybody is referring back to what the ordinance was. To my knowledge, I don't know anybody that has taken a modern one since, and here we go into this, since the 1970s and sent it to a lab to find out. Hi guys, okay, this is a day or two after I had done my part about this, and I have been doing some soul searching about whether or not I should quote some of the loads out of here and why. I feel, and I will quote some of the actual text, that they did an excellent job with this. They actually went the distance to produce the actual chamber pressures being present and see how a change in powder could affect the performance. And you got to understand, back in the day, whenever these guns were being actively used, there were a gajillion of gunpowder manufacturers. They were all black powder. But just like today, you can say smokeless powder. Well, how many companies make, and how many different kinds of smokeless powder are there? There wasn't just one company that made black powder back in that day. There were oodles of them. And they were each trying to get some sort of little niche in the market. So they would have some that were slightly different granulations. Granulations we don't have today. Like 3.5, which was using smaller bore pistols, or 1.4. I have seen a can marked 1.4 before an antique. So there was all kinds of guys trying to give you little advantage, just like today. I mean, realistically, if you take the smokeless powders today and you rate them, and let's say in a 38 special, these pile of powders right here will all produce the same velocity with slightly varying, chamber. Grains would produce the same velocity. There isn't any one of them that, oh my God, it outperforms everybody else. It's application, okay? So that's what we're talking about here, is application. I said 4F. I do use 4F in 31 calibers, and I have used it in 36. Excuse me, let me quote this to you first, and then we'll go a little more in depth. I'm going to show you the loads, some of the loads, okay? Now, as I showed earlier, see this picture right here? It's in a V block, and on top of that, what's happened is they have drilled a hole into the actual chamber, and then you've got this V-block sitting on top of it as seal, and then right there is a stack of copper, think like a watch battery right there. On firing, the pressure pushing up will compress those, and it's called cup units of pressure. Today we use PSI. But at the time of this in the 1970s, this was what was used from the military on down on how you said the pressure, chamber pressure was, and everything from a 25 ACP to a howitzer. This was the standard of measurement that they used. It was called cup units, copper units of pressure. They would drill a hole, put this device up there, the pressure would squeeze that copper, and the difference between how thick it was at the beginning versus how thick it was at the end is the way it worked. You still use a similar type of crush gauge in automotives. You can go to the automotives place and get that little thin plastic gauge where you screw it down how flat it wide it is. You then measure it, and it'll tell you how much clearance you got. Same idea. It's how much pressure was being absorbed, and it was very accurate. Now today we have, this was analog technology. Today we have digital that does the same thing. But in this day, that's the way they did it. And it goes into how they, let me see here. Quote, to investigate chamber pressures encountered during firing of two of the most popular guns, a 36 caliber and a 44. Lyman technical staff produced two handguns, a replica 1851 Navy squareback 36 and a Colt 1860 Army 44 were chosen for their open top configuration. A machined steel block was attached to top of the cylinder with silver solder. A hole was drilled down through the block into the revolver chamber. The hole had a crush piston of suitable dimensions with hand lapped to a perfect fit on top. All charges were weighed exactly. There was zero variation. So when they said a 20 grain charge, it was weighed exactly 20 grains. Now things are measured in volume, okay? But that's what they're saying. When we said it was 20 grains, it's 20 grains, okay? They would volume it, dump it, and it would be exactly, they would accept no variation. So everything was very dialed in. Now, let's look at how it can affect. Now this is from page 70, and this is the 31 caliber. Now, round ball, 50 grains, using 3F powder, okay? A 13 grain charge, velocity 570 feet per second, muzzle energy 36 foot-pounds, okay? Now, the same gun, the same everything, 13 grain charge, a 4F. Hope you can see that. 4F. This one produced 570 with 3F. It produced 749 with the 4F for a difference of 36 pounds of foot-pounds of energy on the 3F and 62 on the 4F. Pretty impressive change, isn't it? Nearly double the foot-pounds of energy of it. So that took that little 32 and hopped it up a little bit by going to 4F. But still, the pressures, let me see if it lists the pressure. Does not list the pressure, but all of them were within spec. That means they had established what the maximum pressure, not the load, the pressure that the manufacturer said, do not exceed, I'm going to make up a number here, guys, and say like 12,000. And then this load will produce whatever. And so they're talking down here in the pressures of it. Now this is the 36 caliber, 51 Navies. Round ball, 81 grain weight. Round ball, 81 grain weight. We're going to go to the top and show it. With 3F powder. 29 grains, maximum powder charge. That's all you could get in there and still compress it and use it. 29 grains produced 1,097 feet per second, a chamber pressure of 9,440, and generated 216 foot-pounds energy. Same everything, but now 4F, but you can only get 27.5 in it. 1,090, actually a little bit slower. 9,660, a little bit higher chamber pressure, but not huge. 213 foot-pounds of energy. So in this, the 3F outperformed the 4F. And that's something that whenever, you got to understand how the powders work. 4F, much finer, it ignites and burns faster. Think of that 0 to 60. But in doing so, it kind of goes whoop, and it doesn't have time to fully push the pressure up because it does combust so fast. Heavier powder will, in the long run, generate more pressure. It just takes slower to build up to that. Because the grain size of 4F is so small, there's not as much, we'll say, stored energy in it. It burns faster, but it doesn't have as much stored energy in it as the bigger grains. And that's the reason you see a difference. Now, in my personal experience of utilizing loads and experimenting some with 4F and 3F, in the little 31s, the 4F, yeah, okay. Power Dex 4F, that's my go-tos because it gives me the best velocity and gives me the best consistency. You go on up to the bigger things like a Dragoon, forget 4F. The velocity is not as good actually as 3F because your volume of how much powder has now come up and it isn't doing as well. You know, we'll see that in a second. Okay. And then it goes to talking about, here is a 3F load using a conical bullet. Okay. 15 grains maximum charge, 668 feet per second, 8,500 pressure. Notice the other one was 9,000, so that's over 1,000 foot-pounds less pressure. Generating 148 foot-pounds of energy. That's with 3F. Same projectile, 4F. 15 grain charge, 787 feet per second. Over 100 feet per second faster. But the pressure went to 11,200. See? 206 foot-pounds. Yes, you did increase it, but now you're up there toward, 12,000 limit, and we're at 11,002. Let's jump to the 44 caliber, 1860 Army. Round ball, 138 grains, 3F powder, 37 grains maximum for this particular gun, or these guns. And you can have slight variations, okay? In this particular gun, 37 was the maximum they could get in there and load it. And it still have clearance for the ball, to not drag. There is slight variation from makes and models. And so that's the reason I do the entire fill the chamber up volume and find out what the volume capacity is of this particular gun when I'm working out a load. Because I've seen it vary 5 or 6, 7 grains. I've seen those that had a 35 grain maximum. And I've seen those that had a 42 grain maximum. It's just how much it's walled out down at the bottom, around the nipple, how much of a cone and how much of a cylinder it is. If the cylinder goes down further, it's got a higher capacity. If it turns more into a cone down to the nipple, it has slightly less capacity. So you got to go by capacity. But this particular 1860 Army, 37 was the maximum. This is 3F again. It was 1,032 feet per second. 7,940 foot-pounds, units of pressure, and 326 foot-pounds of energy. The next one is a 3F load. Let's see if I have a 4F. Yes. 4F load. 37 grains, 960 feet per second. 1,032. The 4F is not producing as much velocity. And they're both round balled, same that. The 3F was 7,940 foot-pounds of pressure. Excuse me. Incorrect. It was 7,940 units of pressure, copper units of pressure. Under the triple F, it was 7,420, so comparable in pressure, but we lost velocity. Its energy is 282 foot-pounds of energy. Under the other one, it was 326. So in that, 3F is outperforming the 4F. You see what I'm saying? You're reaching the point of diminishing returns. Now for target loads, well, we're going to load down with say 5 or 10 grains, because all we're doing is punching a hole in a piece of paper. Okay. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos, but let's touch on this for a second. My personal suggestion and my personal use is there are 3 load levels that I develop for my guns. Number 1 is a target load. What is the least amount of powder, with or without a filler, that I get the tightest possible group. I'm not worried about power here. I'm not hunting anything with this. All I want to do is punch a hole in a piece of paper. How low and at what point? Now, once I go to say less than 15 grains or so, and this is going to vary with guns now, remember we talked about volume, is how far the rammer can compress the ball and still compress the powder. When the rammer reaches, this is as deep as it goes, and we put powder that's less than that, there's an air gap, always a bad thing. So that's when you start adding corn wheat filler. So what I tell people is, whenever you go on a 44, when you go under 20 grains, add filler. Hunting a target load. That way I can do, 5 grains of powder, fill the chamber up with cream of wheat, put the ball on it and compress it, and use that. And we'll get a good, because now I've got compression on that powder, no air charge. All I'm looking for is what is the load that generates the tightest possible group for shooting paper targets. That might be 10, 12, 7, whatever. You just got to experiment and play with it. That's getting down there, and that's a lot of work. But once you find it, yes, that's what we used to call the beer budget. That's the beer money load. You get out there and go pop. But no recoil or nothing, and it poked the best hole. And if the beer money is simply on who's got the tightest group in the 9-ring, 10-ring, or whatever, of course. Then there's the maximum load. This is normally accomplished with some sort of conical or some big ball, and the object of that is that's a hunting load. I want the maximum horsepower I can get. Okay? Those are dirty. They foul up the gun fast. There's a lot more boom, bam, and recoil. Okay, and for 90% of the shooting is not needed. Between those two will be a middle ground where I've got an accurate load with a standard round ball, and I'm not wasting powder. I'm getting up there and shooting, and it seems to have got good power, good accuracy, and everything's great. Okay, that's my 3 loads: target, general purpose, and a heavy hunting load. Okay. So by looking at this information, if I was going to be going down a super light target load, 4F might be the way to go. Might work. On the other hand, if I'm going real heavy, 4F is absolutely not the way to go, because you see the velocity drops off. When the volume goes up, it starts getting in its own way. It doesn't work as well. There's got to be X amount of oxygen in here, and that finer powder compressing more, there's less air available than the coarse powder, and that affects combustion as well. Now, 44 cal, let me jump up to, I think this is the biggest, yeah, the Ruger Old Army Dragoon Power, right? 41 grains, 4F, with a round ball, 1,021 feet per second, 331 feet per second. But, that's, like I said, 4F. You go over here and you look at the 3F, and it's slightly, that's a 4, that's a 3, that's a 3, 900 something. This particular gun liked the 4F in a 44, It's not out of reason. Now the manufacturers, as I say, they're playing lawyer. Okay. The manufacturers, when they recommend a load for a given firearm, they're talking longevity, and they're coming from the mindset of a target gun and a gun that's being used for enjoyment, not heavy hunting, not as a personal defense weapon, not as a big, major cannon. You're not fighting a war with these anymore, you know what I mean? And so they're more of a general purpose. And by going lighter, it doesn't foul as fast, there's not as much boom and bam, the components do not wear out as fast, etc. So like I said, that middle ground load, a general purpose load, is what they're kind of recommending. The guns are capable of more horsepower if you need it. Most times you do not. So in looking at powders, okay, understanding that the only powder that I really have concerns about, okay, is 777, because when you read it, when you look at the manufacturer's recommendations, they tell you do not compress this powder much, just seed it, that's it, because the pressures spike. And when you see online these guys that are shooting across the chronograph and they're using 777 and they're getting these hot velocities, I can understand experimenting to get a heavy hunting load with that. Okay? That's not going to be my general purpose load. If you want that kind of horsepower, go get a 357 Magnum or a 44 Magnum. Don't even look at a black powder revolver. This is a 150-year-old design. It's a design that's good and is a great field gun. Learn how it works, learn its limitations, you know. And it's just like modern cars or whatever. You understand that you can add nitrous to a car and double or triple its horsepower, right? It also wears the engine out in just a couple of days, and most of the drag racers that put it on it and they go down to the drag strip, they'll tell you about how they blew pistons out and they just come apart because the standard engine is not designed. A custom built race engine, which has got light years better technology attached to it. Yeah, it can take the nitrous quite a bit and you can make a good race motor, but even then they come apart easy. See, so with that, adding that to the car, it's not a go up and down the street daily driver anymore. Okay, when you start climbing up into the super, you know, you're taking 777 and compressing it and getting those high velocities, that huge boom and bam, you're stressing the gun. Yes, it has a purpose. Yes, it's safe, but for how long? So you're going to wear the gun faster. I want longevity. I want to be able to utilize the gun and get it to give me years and years and years of good service. And so that's where I'm coming from. Okay? Hope this clarifies any questions. Okay? Please leave more in the comments. I'll be glad to answer as best I can. Okay, now we're going to do a detailed strip to show you how to take one apart. And as I do this, I'm going to show you little tips and tricks of how to accurize and little things to look for as you're doing it. So let's start with the three basic components. First, we're going to press down and pop out the key, the wedge I should say. Take off the barrel, take off the cylinder, have the action. Let's start with the barrel. Now on the front sight of the 1860 Army is this barleycorn, this blade. Okay. As I've stated in other videos, the rounded sight was very popular in the late 1800s. They believed that it allowed the glimmer of light to reflect off of it and be seen. That's absolutely true. It does make a sight that you can see. However, the light does not appear on the sight in the same place every time. It's based upon, you're looking down the sight toward me, of where the sun hits that blade. So if the sun's coming from this way, this side of the blade is lit up, but not that. That tends to make you want to shoot away from the light, shoot toward the right. And it's because you would see this half and center it up. So it would shift it to that side. If the light was coming the other way, it would shift it that way. If the light was coming from the back of you, you'd see that. If the light was coming from the front of you, it would be no light or shiny up here. So you see a lot of the guns, especially the Smith & Wessons, the Colts, had this rounded front sight in the 1800s. By the early 1900s, we'd gone to what was called a partridge sight. And that was much better for sight pictures for shooting target accuracy. because you wanted a flat face, actually a set of flat kind of undercut from your sight picture, so it was always dark, it was even, it was consistent. And so by the by the early 1900s, that rounded sight had fallen out of favor. So for modern accuracy, what I do is, if I think you can see that on that sight, I've took a file and I put a notch right at the top back of it, so it's like that. I've cut a little L out of it. This makes a flat, and I'm actually undercut a little bit, a dark sight edge into it like a shark hook, so that when I'm looking from this way, the light is not reflective and it's a station. The top is actually flattened a little bit. So I've taken a file and I've just flattened that the highest point, and then right there at the highest point I put the side of the file up there and did that and cut that L into it. It's just a little notch. Now from looking at it from appearances you wouldn't hardly notice it, so I've not ruined the aesthetic, and I've not made it so sharp that it's going to hang on everything. But from a sight picture looking at it, it makes for a flatter, more modern partridge sight, and therefore a little easier on my eyes. Okay. Now the screw right there onto the wedge, that screw should actually be far enough down that when you pull the wedge, it's supposed to come out and lock like that, where that hook of that spring hooks behind the round face of that screw and keeps it captured so that it doesn't come all the way out. I can bow it and take it out, but it allowed me in the field to pull it to that, to be able to put the barrel off and not have that fall off the gun. Okay, this would be bad in combat. Being on a horse, pull this out and go to pull it off and that fall off. I no longer have a gun. Now I got to get down on the ground and try to find it in amongst all of the mud and the grass and everything else. That would be very bad. And so they were supposed to be captured. On many of the original Colts, they're actually so stiff in there that you can't get that wedge out unless you take that screw out. Now many of the reproductions, you can just wiggle and pop it and it'll actually come out. On my Uberti right here, the one I call Shiloh, it's actually captured well enough I would have to take that screw out. You will find some of these where the screw face has actually had a flat spot put in it. So you rotate to the flat spot down, you can take the wedge out. You put the wedge in and you rotate it around, and that half of the screw sticks down into that groove where the spring is and keeps it captured. That's a good thing, so I don't lose this in the field. Okay, we're not going to do that, but you understand. You take the screw out to take the wedge completely out. It is good to perform maintenance and look. Is this slot becoming elongated from shooting? That has a lot to do with metals and wear, how heavy a load, and etc. The wedge is the sacrificial part. If you're going to do a lot of shooting, I recommend you go ahead and get an extra hand. Make it two or three extra hand springs. Hand bolt spring, triggers bolt springs, you know what I'm saying? Not hand, let me be clear, okay? Trigger springs, get 2 or 3 extra, okay? If you're going to replace it with a wire spring, that's a very good idea. That'll last forever. Just go ahead and buy one of them and replace it. I personally recommend you get the Wolf spring made for the, let's say you got a Uberti, or if you've got a Pieta, for the single action army. It's going to be a grunt longer. That's good, because when I put it up there, it already fits the bolt, but the tab going back for the trigger is going to be a little bit long. Now it's going to be about the size of a straightened out paper clip, so I can take a file and easily wear that down to make it fit properly. Once you put it on there, it's going to be there for years and years. And if you're going to be doing a lot of heavy shooting, I would recommend it. It's something like 8 or 10, 12 bucks from Wolf Springs, and just say, I want, if you have a Uberti gun, so I want the Uberti single action army, that wire spring, replace it. Okay. Brownells and Wolf Springs, carry them. Just contact Wolf, W-O-L-F-E, Springs, and say I want it for that single action army. And again, it will be a grunt too long. Therefore, I cut it to fit. And once I do, it'll be there the rest of your life. Wedges. Get 3 wedges. Make sure they go ahead and fit. because this is the sacrificial part. It's designed in the Colt design to take the beating and therefore batter up, and rather than the barrel and the cylinder batter up, the wedge takes it. So when it gets to where it's kind of loose and your barrel kind of rock, replace the wedge. That's sacrificable for that, okay? The screw that goes here into the rammer, I would recommend about every other time you clean the gun, take that screw and just break it loose and then retighten it. That makes sure that it's not frozen in place. If it's frozen in place and down the line you ever have to take it out, yeah, you got a problem. Simply break it loose, take it back, snug it up. This should not be blood tight, it should be really snug. Blood tight and it's binding too much and then it's like trying to ram it. This should be fluid. See, if it's too tight, it don't want to go. If it's too tight, the screw can stick through on the backside and drag going down and in like that one is. Now I've over tightened it and see, it don't want to work. If I take it back just a grunt like that, now it runs smooth. Okay, that screw rarely ever comes out. If your screw is a little loose and it might want to back off on its own, just put a drop of clear fingernail polish on the thread and screw it in and it'll be fine. Okay, but that works fine. Again, in cleaning we want to wipe down the forcing cone of the barrel back here on your gun. When you get it, take your fingertip, put it in there and gently turn. Be careful, it may be sharp, but we want that edge kind of smooth, okay? If it is not, if it's rough, you can take a little bit of sandpaper, just a square piece, put it bear down with your fingertip and turn and kind of sand the edge a little bit. It should be smooth. Going inside, take your pinky, push the sandpaper in and twist, you know, and then a little bit of steel wool. You want it to be a transition so that when the ball leaves the chamber and it goes into the back of the barrel, it's not encountering sharp wire edges, because that would grab the ball. Yes, the rifling is going to grab the ball, but if it grabs the ball in the wrong way, it kind of tears the lead and makes a non-uniform bullet going down the barrel and will greatly affect accuracy. The original guns had what was called gain twist, which means it was actually straight. So the ball could jump and land, and then it began. So it started straight back here at the back, and then it caught up and got faster and faster, called gain twist. It's gaining speed. Moderns are not. They're just the same from beginning to end. But again, it should be where that ball can jump and land. So make sure it's not rough back there. If you've got a Dremel tool, one of the actual heads, don't put it in the Dremel tool. Sit it in there by hand. You can turn it, and you'll know, just take the barrel up there and fit it. That's what I've done. And turn it and make sure it works. Now, most of the modern Ubertis and modern Piettas, you're never going to have to do this, because today with cowboy action, these guns are set up to have these little perks to them to improve accuracy. But if you got an older gun that may have been a kit gun that you picked up that was in somebody's closet forever, just check it, okay? The pinholes right there where the alignment pins go, make sure that they are not burred up and there's nothing standing up. Now, you're going to hear this. If, see, there's a little bit of wiggle. There's supposed to be a little bit, okay? If this is too long, this length right here, that pushes the barrel up. If it is a little bit too short, it causes the barrel to cam down too far, okay? If this is too long, they'll tell you that this causes the barrel to shoot a little bit high. You can take that right there and take a some sandpaper, wrap it around something flat like a file, and go straight across, like 10 strokes this way, 10 strokes that way, so it's even. You don't want to have it dished down on one side. That'll make it shoot left or right. But just a few, 10 strokes, 10 strokes, and take a couple of thousandths that way and let the barrel settle down. That may drop your point of impact a little bit. In my video that I've talked about how to accurize, I tell you, do all those tricks first before you start modifying that, because that is a very little bit makes a big difference, and you can easily get the gun where it's not shooting anywhere where you want it to, and you can't put metal back easy. So accurize other things and then use that as a last ditch. Okay, the cylinder, make sure your chamber mouths do not have a wire edge. Again, put a piece of wet dry sandpaper somewhere around the 350, 400, 300, 400 grit. Wet dry I like because you can wet it and make a smoother finish. Take your fingertip, press in and turn to cut that wire edge all the way around. I want it, when I go to load it, I want it to swedge as much as it cuts. If this wire edge is too sharp, it cuts more than it really needs to. In essence, if you could look at the chamber in a cross section, the top, instead of being vertical, is kind of leaned in a thousandth or so, and it's actually shaving and making the ball a touch undersized. So that cutting that heavy ring can be a bad thing if it's too big. Okay, I want this beveled out just a grunt instead of beveled in. And so if it's got a sharp wire edge, put you some sandpaper up there, bear down and go all the way around. You're not going to hurt it. Don't go extreme. This is just make sure it's smooth, that when I take my fingertips I can do like that and I ain't got to worry about getting cut. The arbor in the center, don't worry about. It can be a little wire edge. That's fine. That's going to keep tolerance for flash from going into the base pin and binding the gun up. Okay. The nipples, as I've said in earlier videos and etc., if you've got a real cap problem, if you pull the trigger and the hammer drops, it's going click, click, but it's not firing. It could be that the nipples are just a touch short. In Colt's design, this was meant to be sacrificable. Remember, we talked about the metallurgy was not great. So why didn't you just make out a part of the cylinder, have them mill it out? Because then you couldn't replace it. And nipples were going to get battered up and need to be replaced. So when you get one brand new, I suggest you take them out, clean them, look at them, make sure they're good, and put anti-seize on the threads and put them back in. Okay? That way you can always get them out later. If I'm pulling the hammer and it's going to click and not firing, they may be seated just a touch too far in. Getting on there with the nipple wrench and just back them off like 1/8 of a turn would cure that problem, because you made the nipple a touch longer. Now when it's hitting, life's great. Okay. If on the other hand you're having a problem where I'm pulling the trigger, the hammer's going all the way down, and then it jams up somehow and it doesn't want to cock, it's at precisely the place that the hammer's getting to, and the bolt is coming up to the cam, but it's not popping over the cam, it's hooking on the cam. And so the hammer can't come back because the bolt leg is in the way. Okay? Again, length of the nipple. Try tightening them just a grunt. We're talking about the thickness of a piece of paper. We'll shift it one way or the other and make it work better. Okay? Your drag mark going all the way around. We'll talk about that when we get to the bolt. But you can flat top the bolt just a touch and keep that drag mark from going around and around from being so bad. What's happening is it's going down, but it's not truly going down far enough, the top of the bolt, and it's actually riding by spring pressure to the next one. We can just take a file and flat top the bolt just a grunt to eliminate that and make it where it's not cutting in such a groove. Okay? Now we're ready to break down the action and go over parts of it. Make sure that your alignment pins right here are properly staked in place and not coming out. They can come out. They're just a friction fit. Okay? In fact, I have at my 51 Navy, I've had to JB weld one of them back in place because it would just come out. Now imagine me in the field pull this out and I lost a pin. Then I go make a pin or go buy a pin. So just a tiny bit of JB weld at the bottom of the hole, press it back in place, and it held fine. And make sure these are not loose and don't turn. Your opening for the wedge, this should not be super sharp. So So take a file and go all the way around. The tiny little needle files you can buy at Harbor Freight or stuff like that. You don't have to invest a lot. But just make sure those edges are not super sharp. They should be kind of sharp, but not where you're going to touch it and cut. Because what's happening is on firing, it's battering it a little bit right there, and it can form a little wire edge. Well, that wire edge can lock the barrel in place, and it can also lock the wedge in place. So on the outside, kind of bevel that opening a little bit on both sides, especially up here at the front point, because what's going to happen is you'll bevel it because it's been firing, and it'll get to where it'll snag it. It'll get where it doesn't want to let the barrel come off and trying to get the barrel off. That's where that hang up comes in. All right, now that we've talked about loads a little bit, a proper load in this is whatever the gun shoots most accurately. Now it's going to vary anywhere from 25 to 35 grains. Your gun is just going to be unique. You're going to have to do some field trials. Now I'm going to do a shooting demonstration here in a minute. But bottom line is, a lot of guys on videos are going to show you how to shoot, but they don't give you in depth. And I'm going to give you more in depth instead of just a shooting video where I come out and burn a lot of powder. You can get that anywhere. I want to give you a little bit more insight. So we're going to do a detailed breakdown of this. And as I break the gun down, I'm going to point out to you all the little steps that I do to improve accuracy and to make it a better shooter. We're going to talk about how to step the sight. We're going to talk about the forcing cone. We're going to talk about loose arbors on it, how to take care of that. We're going to talk about sighting. We're going to talk about mainsprings, etc. So let's now talk about a detailed breakdown. Okay, now I'm going to use a proper size fitting screwdriver. These sets are available, relatively cheap and inexpensive. You can use others, but you want to make sure that you're not going to bugger up the screws. And so I recommend an actual set of the tips that go to a gun set, okay? I think mine was like $14, $15, and if you're going to have guns, they're well worth it. Alright, we're going to start by disassembling the gun to this part. We're going to come here into the heel of the grip, and we're going to loosen that screw. Not take it completely out, but loosen it. Like 3 turns, something like that. Now what that's going to do is take the tension off the top of the grip back strap. Get my eyes on. Also having a small bowl. These magnetic bowls are cheap at Harbor Freight, like $1 or something on sale. Well worth it for small parts. There's a tension in the grip frame. So by loosening that, it creates a gap right there now. And that is relieve the pressure up here. If you just take the screws out, it's torquing the screws. And they come out and you start wearing the threads. So come up here and take the top screw out. You see how I put my thumb up against the screw as I'm turning it? That keeps the screw from taking off when it comes all the way out. Now I can take the screwdriver off and that screw doesn't go flying. These 4 grip screws are the same. This screw and this screw is unique. Okay? Now take out the other one right here. See how I'm setting my finger up there as a guide for the side of that screwdriver, and then as the screw comes out, it'll guide onto the screw. Keeps a little tension on it. Now pull it out, put that one right there, reverse, and I'm going to just, now it's just finger, take off the grip base. Off comes the grip. I take that unique screw and put it back in place. Sorry for all the traffic noise. I live out on a county road in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes of the day, it seems like everybody's got to run through over here. Off comes the grips. Coat the inside of the grips with plain old car wax and buff it so that any moisture gets under here, it doesn't warp it. If your grips are not finished, in a lot of the production guns, you take the grip off and they're not finished at all. They just did the surface. Make sure the inside here gets a coating so that moisture does get in there, because you get caught out in the rain or whatever, your grips don't warp and split. Okay? There's nothing we worry about on the back strap other than take it off ever so often. Give it a wipe down, because black powder fouling will get up under here sometimes and give it a coating of wax or oil or something just to make sure it's protected. Okay. Now I'm going to go to the mainspring and I'm going to take like 2 turns off of it. 3. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my thumb on the spring. I'm going to push the spring down. If you've got, and just push it down, make sure it's unlocked from up there. I'm going to go to the front grip screw, and I'm going to unscrew it. It is unique. Don't lose it. I'm going to put it in that magnetic bowl right there. I'm going to come to the one to the left of the trigger guard back here, unscrew about halfway, go to the other one. Now when I start unscrewing this, I'm releasing tension on that mainspring. Okay? Now that this is wiggly, I can take my thumb, you see that? Let me demonstrate that again. I take my thumb and put it down on the mainspring and push it to the side. And now that the mainspring is completely loose, no tension. I then go to that screw, unscrew the mainspring, lay it down, put that screw back. Okay? Now I take out the 2 grip screws. I don't want any tension. A lot of people will just let it go pop. That can be a bad thing. You're putting undue stresses on things. You wear out threads. You wear out threads into the frame. You can cause springs to break. It's far easier just to do it this way. Now lift off the trigger guard. Now this exposes the internals. You've got the large screw right there that is holding your trigger spring. Notice which way, like a clock, that groove is facing. That groove is facing in about the 11 o'clock position. Okay. This screw does not have to be blood tight. In fact, it was designed to add a little tension to as this spring got weaker over time. Because it being in a held position, it would eventually weaken. Again, this is Colt's design. So it was allowed to be adjustable. So don't just bottom it all the way out. Now I'm going to unscrew it. When it gets almost out, put my thumb up there, see? Capture it so it don't go flying. Out comes that great big screw. Out comes the spring. Now, shifting over to the trigger, I'm going to open up the trigger screw. And the trigger screw and bolt screw are identical, so they're interchangeable. Pull it out. Out comes the trigger. Now take the bolt screw out. Okay, now inside, push down on the bolt and that will lift it up. You can now take the end of your screwdriver and kind of lift up the bolt just like that. And now the bolt comes out of the gun. Now we do the hammer screw. Unscrew it, pull it out. The hammer comes back and slides downhill and out. And there is the hand. Okay? Now, as you can tell, this gun was fired in the recent video we did, and I have not cleaned it yet. Let me wipe this down right quick. Let's talk about the frame for just a second. Okay, starting with the frame. Okay, I've already talked about the pins, I've already talked about the base pin. Right here in the slot where the hand rides, make sure there isn't a bunch of burrs or whatever in that slot. That will drag the hand and affect a lot of things, so you want it as smooth as possible. The opening right here in the inside where the bolt comes up from the bottom, Make sure with needle files that there's no burr there, because that will also bind up the bolt and cause timing issues and stuff. Right here on the shield, the cap shield, there is a groove cut. This is the ejection port for broken caps to slide out. This is quite often burred up and sharp, especially this top corner. Make sure you smooth that out so that the cap fragments will just slide out and fall out. If they're hanging up on stuff, they're staying in the action. We don't want that. We want them to go and fall out of the action. On some of the Colts, we'll have these extra 2 screws. These are for a shoulder stock to lock, and you notice this notch right here in the recoil shield. That's for the ears of a shoulder stock to lock, sometimes called military set. Okay. On your mainspring, make sure that there is no burrs. It should be nice and rounded and smooth. Modern ones that are now produced are light years better than what we had years ago, but if you got an older gun, check it. If it's got a wire edge, that's a big red flag. It's going to snap. So you want to take a file and smooth it off. You want your mainspring to be smooth, the opening, everything. It should have a little groove right there for the roller and the base of the hammer. Speaking of the hammer, let's go ahead and wipe this one down. Notice, I don't know if you can see that or not, but on this hammer there's a lot of fouling right there. I was shooting really heavy loads out of it this last time, and that fouling will build up in there and here in the frame and act like a cushion and get to where she doesn't have reliable ignition, because it's landing on that fouling like thud rather than snapping into position. It's and what that is blowback coming out of the after the cap buzz, coming out of the nipple, blowing down the slot and back down into the action. So that's something you need to be aware of. When you cock the hammer, is it really fouled back in here? If so, take something and wipe it out. A little bit of water on a rag will do wonders for washing it out right quick. The bolt. The bolt does the job of locking the cylinder in place. Now this top of the bolt right here, this is the part that sticks up. Looking at it with this line right here, this edge laid flat, this top piece right here, you can take a file and just barely break the top of it. It's kind of hardened, but you just want to make sure that that top is a little flat. That will keep your cylinder drag to a minimum, because it's too round and it's sticking up too far. When it's in the frame and it's locked all the way down at half cock, it should be at or slightly below that opening right there. If it's still sticking up a grunt, that's enough to make the drag mark. Okay. The hand and the handspring. Check on the inside curve, make sure there's no burrs. Check on this top back right here. This is often very burred because this is made at high speed with something like a Dremel tool and then fitting it. So feel all of that, make sure there's no burrs. If there are burrs or spurs or sharp edges, it's dragging on the frame. It should slide on the frame. If it's sharp, it's cutting into the frame, because this is a hardened part, and it will cut the frame and therefore make it real rough where it'll never be a smooth action. The trigger, this top part, that high tooth right there, is the sear. That's what actually hooks to the hammer, and when you pull the trigger, lets go and lets it fall. And they work together like this, where this hooks into that notch in the hammer right there. That's the half cock. When you pull it further, there's a lower notch. That's the full cock. When you pull the trigger, the hammer slides, so they actually sit kind of like that together. So when it pulls back, click, that's in half cock, click, that's in full cock. And that is basically the interconnection of it. Now I'm of course going to do a thorough cleaning, but for right now we're going to put the gun back together so you can see the reassembly process. And we're going to start by taking the frame in our hand. We're going to take the hand and we're going to put it into the hole on the hammer, just like that. Now, putting your finger on top, see how I'm gripping the hammer with my fingers? I'm going to hold the frame, and there's a slot right there. I'm going to slide that spring wants to hang up. So I'm going to put the spring in first, push against the spring, and then the hand will slide in. If you don't do it that way, you can break the spring or warp the spring. Now simply slide it upward and into position. It's a little bit of a wiggle, wiggle, wiggle sometimes, because it's how well that hand wants to engage in there and how well that hand wants to work its way through that slot. Alright, now come on, there we go. Oops. This one's got a real tight hand. So I have to kind of guide it up in there. Come on, get on in there. Come on. Alright, looking through the hole in the frame, a line up for the big hammer screw. Put that in. Put your thumb beside the screw. Put the screwdriver on top of your thumb and then put it in the slot. And use your thumb sort of as a guide. It keeps you from sliding off and scratching everything. So you can turn it. Because what happens is you stick it up there and you go do like this and you start doing this and you start scratching up your frame. Okay? So stick it in there. Tighten it up. Now, work it. Make sure it's working. Okay? Now we're going to do the bolt. The bolt, we're going to take the twin ears back here on the back. We're going to slide them in first, and then we're going to push it forward and then kind of backing down into position. Looking through the front hole right there, we now take our bolt screw, run it into position, wiggle, 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 go all the way across. Again, put the thumb up there, put the screwdriver tip in there and use it for a guide. Just go like that. Snug it up. Trigger. Slide the trigger in place. Align the hole. Wipe that screw off right quick. Alright. Put that through. Sometimes it can be a little bit fiddly. Get it to line up right. Especially if you got a good tight action. I like to look through the hole and wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Alright, it's all the way in there. Now put my thumb up there for a rest. Go up, go in the slot. Torque it up. Okay. Now holding the front of the frame and holding the trigger forward with my thumb, pull back. Click, half cock. Click, full cock, push, it goes forward. Okay? Now, pushing the hammer all the way up, push the bolt all the way down on the inside. Take the spring, put the long end of the spring on that shelf of the trigger and lay it up on the opening. See how my thumb catches it? Now take that short fat screw, put up there and take your fingertip and turn it to get it started. There we go. Now, click, click, bang. Make sure that when it comes back and it goes click, that bolt's all the way down. Okay? Now pull back, click. Did it go all the way into full cock? Is the bolt up? The bolt's not up far enough. That tells me that screw is not tight enough. So remember what position it was in, 11 o'clock. This 11 o'clock that I put it in is obviously not the correct 11 o'clock. I gotta go around one more time. Now, when that bolt is up, I pull it back one click. It's now in half cock. That's now flush or below, so I ain't gotta worry about dragging a cylinder. When I pull it back to main cock, click, it pops up. It's locked, it's fully up. Now I push in there. So I know that spring's right position, and you can see it's now pointing back at 11 o'clock. Now, I take my trigger guard, I set it up there, and I'm going to line up that front screw, and I'm just going to start it. Like that. Okay. Now I drop in the two back screws. Okay. Just get them started. Like 2 turns. Make sure they're not going to fall out. Now unscrew the screw for the mainspring. Set the mainspring up there and hook up that screw. Couple turns down. I'm going to take my thumb, I'm going to push down, move it underneath. Put your thumb right there to catch it so you don't do like I just did and run past it. Move it underneath so it's sitting directly underneath the hammer, just like that. Now putting my thumb in the trigger guard, I kind of squeeze. Okay? Now I go to that screw on the trigger guard and I tighten it up. That will have the mainspring now captured. And I will do the front one right here. Front trigger guard. Now, looking and making sure that spring is in proper, there's a roller on the back, and there's a race on that spring for it to be in. It is. Now, I take my thumb and put right there, and I tighten up my main spring. Now, action check. One click, it locked, my bolt's down. Full cock, bolt's locked up, hands in position, trigger there, hammer's there. Everything's working as it should. Now unscrew that unique screw at the base of the trigger guard. I will now take my grip, slide the base in first, rotate it up, looking in the hole. I will take my base screw, drop it in there, and I just want it to engage. Make sure it is engaged. That wasn't. You want to look right here and see that gap, and you'll see that gap start pulling closed. All right, I want a gap about the thickness of a penny. Now when I turn it around, these are lined up where I can do it. If I went and torqued that up, I have to try to squeeze the grip tight in order to line these up, or force the threads to somehow waller in there and pull it down, and I'm wearing out threads. You end up wearing out those screws. Put it up there, get it going. Once that first one goes about flush, you put the second one in. Using that finger as a guide. Second one I'm going to run on home. Go back to the first one. Run it on home. So these at the top of the grip are first. Turn it upside down. I still got that gap right there. I now put it on there, and I bring that gap up. That's what torques the grip. Now go back to all the screws and snug them one more time to make sure they're good and snug, because now they're under bind. Before they were not. They are now. Okay, half cock. Slide on the cylinder, making sure the wedge is fully out of the race. Slide it into position. Line up, start it in, bump it with your hand. It should just come over and the spring pop up on that side. Too tight and it actually squeezes and the cylinder will drag up here on the forcing cone. The wedge again is the sacrificial part. Once you've shot it a while and this starts to open up, replace the wedge and it'll pull it back tight. That's the wedge's job. Cock it, free, full cock, locks in place. Cock very slowly, lock solid. Cock quickly, lock solid. If it's not locking, then that tension on that trigger spring screw is wrong. And that is how we completely broke down an 1860 Army. Okay, now we're going to load up. Now, my loading procedure is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lubricate this barrel. So I've taken a heavily lubed patch of some sort of natural lube that's not petroleum based. I use boar butter, you can use Crisco, whatever. We set it in, just like that. Wiggle it down in there. On mine it's a little tight, but it will go. And then I'm going to have to push it under with my thumb just a little bit. As soon as I get her to seat in that hole. She's not seating right there. There we go, now it popped in. Slide it underneath. Bring down the rammer. Now notice that the Uberti has a coned rammer versus the Pieta's flat. So this fits over that cartridge real well. Kind of, don't be tight on the cylinder. Let it free center itself up. So I always drop it down on there, kind of wiggle it just a little bit so it's all nice and centered. I'm going to put it against my chest and I'm going to pull it in there. Just like that. And I have a mark on my ramrod. You can't see it, but that tells me when I got it down there far enough. Almost. Okay. There we go. She will rotate so she's far enough down. Now let me do the rest of them right quick. Okay, I have now loaded up my 1860 Army with the Johnson & Dow bullets and 20, I think it's 22 grains of Pyrodex powder in a paper cartridge, plus a number 11 Remington cap. Now, usually at this point I'd turn around and shoot and hit it. However, as I've already stated in this, Blackie's eyes ain't what they used to be. Hold on a second, don't turn it off. You will forgive me if I have to put on my spectacles to see these sights. And there's 5. Okay, I was a little off. Here was my aiming point, but they all went right there. That's where all 5 hit, right there. So that's not bad. I'm only off by about, an inch and a half. About that far off, upper right. But still, that's a good group. All of those through there. She's just a touch up and right with that. But all in all, it'll do the job, guys. Okay, now, we've talked history. We've talked about how this gun came about. We've talked about the loads and the controversy about how loads came for these and all cap and ball revolvers. We've done a detailed breakdown and talked about how all the components can be accurized. I hope this answers a lot of your questions about the 1860 Army. I really like my Uberti like this. The Pieta makes good ones as well. But if you're going to shoot conicals, I recommend the Uberti because it already comes with that conical loading rammer that doesn't bang up the front of the conical bullets as bad. Very good, very reliable, a really good field gun. Now, is it my favorite gun for bunnies? No. The 44 is a little big and you got to go for headshots. So for practical field hunting, no. But I'm in a place here in the South, we've got big animals that like to bite you, like big hogs, stuff like that, gators. And if I'm going to carry a cap and ball revolver as a personal sidearm as a woods gun, because I want to, I enjoy the challenge of it, like someone that does archery. Why don't you tote a modern hunting rifle? They enjoy archery. I enjoy carrying a cap and ball revolver. And Shiloh, that's the name of this one, has been a companion of mine in several events, and I really enjoy taking her to the field. Hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Please leave any questions or comments below. And as always, thank you very much for supporting my channel. Till next time, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.